Hello, everyone. Greetings and welcome. My name is Jennifer Karras, and I am the Senior Vice Provost for Academic Affairs. I'm thrilled to be here and not in the board meeting that's going on right this second, so you're much better company. I would like to just comment that in the swirl that we're in right now, whether that is nationally or the chaos of some of the changes that are happening on campus, I am just so heartened to see this community come together for such a good reason, right? We are here to also learn so that we can be the best practitioners that we can be. So it just reminds me what a gift actually the writing program has been to the University of Denver campus. When we, back in, yeah, woohoo! So back in the day when the writing program was first created, the idea was to transform campus, right? To transform the way that we teach writing, the way that we appreciate writing, and not just with our students, with who we are as a faculty. And so this partnership between the writing program and the Office of Teaching and Learning, it's what we're, I don't know, it just makes evident that transformational power that comes together with great faculty. So thank you for that. So I just got lost in that emotional moment, but my job really is just, again, to welcome you here and to thank you all on behalf of the provost and the chancellor, and to say I'm excited to learn along with you. So I am now going to introduce my amazing colleague, Dr. Leslie Alvarez, who has a few things to share.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm Leslie Alvarez. I'm the Assistant Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning, and I direct the Office of Teaching and Learning. And supporting students with disabilities, examining our ableist assumptions, and integrating UDL like other equity work is a journey, not a destination. And as Jennifer alluded, even more important right now. I'm really grateful to Jay for being here with us at DU, and I'm also grateful to you, the fellow travelers on this journey. Our classroom access issues, along with other educational inequities, were painfully exacerbated and illuminated during the pandemic, and DU's been working to uncover what Jay refers to as the steep steps that may serve as barriers to our student and our faculty and our staff success. And this work has been in partnership with many areas across campus, with the OTL as part of Faculty Affairs, the Learning Effectiveness Program, Student Disability Services, especially with regard to our Neurodiversity Institute, which began in 2021. And in collaboration with those same areas and Student Affairs, the Dean of Students, IT, Risk Management, and EOIX, you may or may not know, we've recently convened an Accessibility Council, and many of us have been meeting as a steering committee. And we created, with the help of Eric Hartman, an accessibility blueprint. And we're inviting all areas of campus to consider ways to be more universally designed and accessible, from events to the web to the course and the classroom. We're not perfect, we're all learning, but you may notice some efforts that have taken place in this room to make this event more accessible. And though we're not Zooming, we are recording this event and making it available later on. And I'd like to thank Therese Rainwater for those efforts to help coordinate that. As we welcome Jay, I'm especially grateful for the partnership with the writing program, to Sheila Carter-Todd, Amanda Thompson, Rebecca Schultz-Colby, and to John and Christina Hathery for their generous donation and support that is allowing us to support this visit. I'd also like to thank Sturm College of Law, and particularly Roberto Carrata, who co-sponsored this visit as well and coordinated a lunch for our law faculty yesterday. And this event is a direct follow-up to the Fall Provost Conference on Universal Design for Learning, paving the way for meaningful change. So I'd like to thank Provost Mary Clark for her commitment to advocating for this work at DU. It is a journey. We know professional development around equity work is never a one and done. It's always an ongoing conversation, and I am grateful to all of you for being part of it. So now I'd like to pass the mic to the person who seeded this idea and was instrumental in making this event a possibility, and that is Rebecca Schultz-Colby. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. And I have to say that Jay's visit is actually part of my homework as I attended the Neurodiverse Institute hosted by OTL. And I noticed that OTL faculty were citing Jay's work quite a bit. So my homework was to invite Jay to campus. So that was my, that comes from the Neurodiverse Institute directly. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jay. So Jay's the chair of the English department of the University of Waterloo. And so as part of the writing program, I study the rhetoric of games. So I first came across Jay Dolmage's work when studying the rhetoric of Matus, the cunning that happens in the embodied moment. After all, Matus is at the heart of all gameplay. However, in studying Matus, Dolmage shows how those with difference, whether they are neurodivergent or are women of color, have a form of cunning, a Matus, that comes from seeing the world differently. In his article, Matus, Mestiza, and Medusa, and his book, Disability Rhetoric, Dolmage shows that anyone who does not have the ideal body constructed by Western philosophy is part of the monstrous outside. But of course, this actually means that pretty much everyone in this room is disabled in one form or another. And with books like Academic Ableism, Disability in Higher Education, and Disabled Upon Arrival, Eugenics, Immigration, and the Construction of Race and Disability, and many other articles and book chapters, Dolmage continues to inspire me as a teacher scholar to learn from my students as they always bring their own Matus, rare insights into learning and living, instead of a deficit. With that, it's my honor to present Jay Dolmage.
Thank you, everybody, for being here on a Friday afternoon. It's a beautiful day outside, and we will get to enjoy it. I plan to enjoy it myself as well. And we have some time together, and I'll just describe who I am, what I look like to begin with. My name's Jay. I'm a middle-aged white dude. I got thinning hair. I wear dark glasses. I'm wearing a multicolored shirt, and I use he/him pronouns. I'm coming to you from Canada. 2 hours time difference right now. Quite a bit of a difference in terms of the amount of sunshine for the time of year. And it's been very, very cold in Canada for the last month. It's been -20 many days, which my youngest child, who's a hockey player, has been really enjoying because he can play hockey outside every day. It's wonderful to be here. I haven't been in Denver for 7 years. It's an unbelievable campus. I got a chance yesterday to go undercover for a little while and spend some time in the Student Center. And throughout the talk today, I think I want to try to fold in some of my sense of what I've learned even since I've been here. From some of the folks who introduced me, from some of the new people that I've met as I've been here. And I'm hoping then also that we have lots of time to have questions, for you all to share some of the things that you're doing, ideas that you might have. And I always say this, and I really mean it, sometimes it may take a week, or it may take 5 years or something for what we talk about today to hit an area where you have a question, right? So we'll have lots of time for questions today, but I also really would love to hear from people via email later, right? With questions you maybe can't ask here, or opportunities to work with you or collaborate or give feedback on projects that you're working on, because I know there's a lot of work that's happening here. To begin with, I want to say, whenever I speak, but I also think this is part of a toolkit for us to be able to engage with students around disability, I think it's important to talk about terminology. I gave a lunchtime talk at the law school yesterday, and I asked them to give me some questions ahead of time. And the first question they had was, what's the terminology I'm supposed to use, right? I actually think it can really prevent people from engaging sometimes with disability because we can be afraid we're going to get the terminology wrong. And the truth is the terminology changes. The language that we use changes. And it's important to pay attention to some of those changes. So I want to give a little bit of a guide to the way that I use language, and I hope that that could be something you could steal if you want to, but also a conversation you can have. I mean, I teach writing and rhetoric, so this is my stuff, right? Talking about the words we use, the language that we use. So I think there has been some change over the past 20, 25, 30 years between what we might call person-first language and what we call identity-first language. So when I grew up in Northern Ontario in the 80s, it's part of my own personal story, but I think for a lot of us, we didn't have much engagement with disability. I mean, I did in my family, but in schools, for example, students with disabilities were sent to segregated schools, right? My Uncle Robert, when he was born with Down syndrome, my grandparents were told he can't live at home. And he was institutionalized, and he was abused, and he passed away when he was 11 years old in an institution. Generationally, that's not that long ago, right? So the idea that people with disabilities were warehoused somewhere else is part of the reason why we began to have what we call person-first language. Because people with disabilities were just given labels. And the labels are all of the kind of pejorative, negative terms, the R word, the I word, the M word, that we know we shouldn't use around disability. Those were medical labels, right? People had those things attached to them, and it removed their agency, it removed their independence. It meant that they didn't have the kind of future that other people, even in their same family, had, right? So it was a really big deal to start using person-first language, right? To say we're not going to talk about people as their labels, right? And that's really, really important. And I work with survivors of institutionalization. My family was part of the class. We were the litigation guardians for a class action lawsuit that made the government of Ontario acknowledge that these places were abusive, and to settle with survivors so that they could at least have an apology from the government. In any case, those survivors, they want to use person-first language. Right? That's really important to them. But of course, we could also say, instead of saying students with disabilities, we could say disabled students, because there's also a movement that's maybe more recent to use disability or identity-first language. You can understand how that might work when people say, I don't see my disability as negative, right? I see it as part of my identity. I'd like to be known as capital A autistic, right? And in taking on that language, I'm challenging this idea that disability is only this medicalized negative thing. I might even take back words like cripple, right? And then we've seen that in the disability rights movement, the reclaiming of some terminology, right? So the history is important, right? The language is not neutral. And so in my presentation, I actually am going to move back and forth between person-first and identity-first language, right? And you'll see that that's how it works. Okay, Simi Linton wrote this great book called Claiming Disability for rhetoricians. She has the first chapter. The book is called Reassigning Meaning. The first chapter is called Claiming Disability, and in that chapter, she writes about what she calls nice words and what she calls nasty words. Right? Nasty words are things like the R word, right? The negative, often medical, and I want to say, like, the R word was a medical diagnosis founded in eugenic science, right? And it has never described anything that any medical professional has objectively measured, right? But these words and the negative terms around disability, they actually come to be used to describe all kinds of negative things. Right? Words around disability we use sometimes way too casually to describe anything that's bad, right? Or slow or frustrating, right? Or hard to understand, right? So there's something happening there that we should pay attention to, right? And that's why it matters. It's not about policing language, it's about understanding what impact this language has, right? And there are when you can say in a very kind of almost ubiquitous way, if the association with the word is negative, right, there's a problem. The issue there is that we then became more sensitive around terminology, and there are a bunch of terms that were used to replace traditional disability labels. And that's what Simi Linton calls nice words, right? So for many people, that was like the idea of special education, right? Instead of schools for the feeble-minded, we had special education, right? Well, you all know, if you have kids, special is negative, right? It has become a kind of pejorative terminology, right? A lot handy-capable, right? Differently abled, special needs, right? These things, they came from a good place, right? They were about addressing some of the stigma, but as we know with stigma around a lot of different groups, the language might change, but the stigma is really portable. It'll follow the language. So that's what we see happen with a lot of these terms. But also, I think a lot of the nice words, they can be a little patronizing, right? Infantilizing. And that's a kind of rhetorical trend with disability to begin with, is this idea that people with disabilities should be, treated specially, right? Treated like children. And that is an issue as well. So I avoid these terms, but I also think it's worth raising these things, because the truth is, in our classrooms, we hear students using some of this terminology without examining it, right? And it's not about, again, I don't think it's about policing language, but it's about talking about and reconstructing the ways we think about disability by giving a little bit of the history, right? And by understanding something about language and stigma and stereotypes. Okay, so that's my kind of preamble around that language. I also am going to be talking about ableism. And just like most isms, right, and maybe even more so now than a month ago, we're conscious and we can feel a little embattled when we hear the word ableism. It feels accusatory, right? So again, I think it's worth talking about what is disableism, what is ableism, right? We see these things, they're very common in our culture, right? Disableism is the idea that disability itself is negative, right? It's a set of assumptions, it's stereotypes. It's all the ways that, unfortunately, a lot of the ways that disability is depicted in TV and film and popular culture is this idea that disability is something you wouldn't want to have, right? And I could talk lots and lots about that, but that is that force. Ableism is different, and I think it's worth talking about how it's different. It may not feel like less embattled to say, but we're all ableist, right? And we're part of institutions that advance ableism, that actually are kind of structured around forms of ableism. Maybe nothing more than a university, aside from maybe like a medical school in a university, you know? So it's this idea then that we structure our society to be less disabled. So, for example, disability is all over the curriculum at any university. You want to go find it, it's all over the place. Huge research dollars are devoted to disability, but not as an identity or as a culture, as a problem to be solved, right? To be cured, to be eradicated, to be rehabilitated. We're educating currently here thousands of folks who will become professionals about disability. Unfortunately, for most of them, the ways that they've learned about disability are within a medical model, right? And within a paradigm in which disabled people are not the experts, they are the research objects rather than the researchers. They're the folks being talked about and pictured in the textbooks rather than the authors and the professors, right? That doesn't mean there aren't authors and professors, it just means that's a dominant kind of way that it gets talked about. But also, I mean, ableism, there's a form of internalized ableism that inflects everything we do. It saturates our culture, right? there's no end to the ways that the demands that we feel to be smarter, to work harder, right? To perfect our bodies and minds, to be more socially engaged, right? So if you think about it, and it's worth taking kind of a second to think about, like that kind of ableism, it absolutely inflects the ways that we all see ourselves and one another, right? The snap judgments we make when we first meet people or see people, right? In a way, there's a kind of like, when our brains relax, they relax into a kind of ableism, right? So I just think it's worth talking about how ubiquitous it is. Not to say that there aren't very specific incidents of ableism that reach into people's bodies in violent ways, but to also say in a way that I hope lets students feel less accused, that yeah, it actually impacts all of us. And the point of that then is that if it impacts all of us, A, because we'll all become disabled at some point in our lives, and we all care for and are connected to people who are disabled already, right? We should all care about ableism. I mean, that sounds like a very selfish motivation. You should care because it's eventually going to affect you, right? But it's true. And yet, so much of what we do is designed to push disability away, right? That's not good equipment for any of us. So that's a lot of what I'll be talking about today, okay? The other thing that I think is sometimes worth talking about is what we call a medical model of disability. And like I said, that's very prominent in our curriculum, right? That is the way we're teaching a lot of people to see disability. It's a diagnosis, it's attached to a series of symptoms, it's attached to a series of interventions or treatments, right? And that's all true, you know, like, and you know, I access the medical model, people with disabilities access the medical model, it's important to them, right? But that's not the only way to see disability. We need to have space to see it as an identity and a culture. The legal model of disability interacts with that medical model, especially on a place like a university campus, and that often sets a minimum, right? And leads people to only engage with disability in a minimal way, right? But the flip side of that is what we would call the social model, and I'm hoping that I'll talk more about that today. And at least that gives us the hope that in part disability is constructed, and even the lived experience is in part constructed by how we talk about it, right? By the built environment, by the curriculum choices we might make in the future, by our teaching. What that means is we have some agency, maybe some responsibility. We can change the lived physical experience of disability by thinking about it differently, talking about it differently, teaching about it differently, right? And so that's a part of what you can kind of tell, it gives the structure to my talk here too. This is a Three Little Pigs talk, okay? I'm gonna talk some about the history, some of the things we're living with that structures that we've built, right, that make disability, that have segregated, right, that have led to inaccessibility and lack of access. I'm going to talk about some of the solutions that we've come up with, but also the ways that they may not deliver everything they promise. And then I'm hoping we can have I was going to say the right temperature of porridge. That's a different fairy tale. It's also a Goldilocks. So it's a Goldilocks or Three Little Pigs, whichever one you want. We will get to those solutions. So, okay, so I got to flip along ahead here just to get past the language. I have three metaphors for you. People who've seen my work, they'll be familiar with these metaphors, but the first metaphor is the steep steps, okay? This is an image here from the movie Monsters University. How many of you have seen the movie Monsters University? Terrific, okay. So what we see here, and the Disney and Pixar animators who animated this movie, they studied campuses not unlike yours, campuses on a hill, you know, with beautiful backgrounds, right? But also with Gothic or neoclassical architecture, right? With steep stairs, and we see in this image Greek columns in the front, we see Gothic spires behind, we see a clock tower. I could talk more about time and clocks. And in the foreground, against this very traditional backdrop, and they studied Harvard and Stanford and the University of Toronto, to build this. It's monsters. Okay, so it's a very interesting movie in the sense that we have the most traditional possible structures, and then we have the most diverse possible bodies against that backdrop. And so, spoiler, probably alert, but do people know what happens it's a happy ending to the movie. Do you know what the happy ending is? The main characters drop out of university. They do, right? And sorry to the deans in the room, deans are not depicted very generously. But the monsters are made to jump through what are shown to be really artificial hoops that have nothing to do with where they want to be or who they are, and they eventually reject that game, right? That's actually a very, very common theme when you look at the popular culture depictions of university. That's a really popular theme, that what we're doing here is divorced from what students want or need, that it's arbitrary, that it's unfair and cruel, that students are misfit for these traditional structures that refuse to change, and we should care. This is probably the most popular depiction of higher education that we have, is the most seen one. We should care that the happy ending is students drop out. Okay, so next image, this is, it's not gonna animate, but this is a monster, right? One of the monsters from the foreground, and this is a slug monster wearing a backpack. And in the opening credits of the movie, we see all the monsters, the bells are ringing, students, you can see the bell tower, students are rushing to get to class on time, right? And it's very clear, this student is rushing as fast as they can, right? But not moving very far. And at the end of the movie, in the closing credits, we come back and we see this hasn't made very much progress, right? But I think that's a metaphor for me, even though this student is not on the steep steps. It's a metaphor for this idea that universities are stepped, that some bodies that some bodies are built for it, and that others, or bodies and minds, are made for it, and others aren't. But also that universities have this role, societal function of stepping society, deciding who deserves access to power and privilege, knowledge, connection, right, and who doesn't. And I'm kind of here to say that along the axis of disability, universities, higher education is doing a very efficient job of sorting the population based on arbitrary ideas of ability, on a medical model of ability. The CDC tells us that 25% of the population is affected by disability, right? It tells us that 19.5% of post-secondary students have a disability, right? But 13% of US citizens 25 or older with disability have a bachelor's degree or higher. That compares to 31% of the general population, okay? We know, for example, that just 41% of students with disabilities complete their post-secondary education. We know that students with disabilities have up to 60% more student debt by the time they graduate, right? There are all these ways that the steep steps, right, and the kind of slowing, right, has a real tangible impact on students with disabilities. We know that students sorry, give me 1 second. We know that students who do seek accommodations are likely to do so only in their 3rd or 4th year of school, right? We know that some studies show us that up to 2/3 of disabled college students, their university will never know that they have a disability, right? We also know that students get accommodations in K-12 education. For example, students with learning disabilities in K-12 education, 91% of students with learning disabilities in high school get an accommodation, right? But only 17% of those same students, when they come to college or university, get an accommodation. The very thing that might have allowed them to get to this stage, they don't want it when they get here. And that's the cultural impact of this metaphor of steep steps. It's this idea that here, you're supposed to work harder. Here, you're supposed to work more independently, right? Here, you're not supposed to foreground disability. And we can understand that in some ways because of the stigma, right? It's not an environment, it's an environment where all of a sudden everybody is really good at everything, right? It's very difficult to start a relationship with a professor, with someone you look up to, you admire, with other students by saying, I'm different, right? So we can understand how it works, but that doesn't mean we should accept it, right? The other message that I think students get is that if they were to ask for help, they'd somehow be cheating the system, right? So I'll give you an example here, right? We know that there is outright discrimination against students in higher education. It's widely reported, right? Then leads to students not wanting to disclose their disabilities, right? And I'll give an example of this. Students who get a diagnosis later in life, right? Students who get a diagnosis as a university-age young person, right? They actually believe that the diagnosis they get is much more limiting than even the medical professional who gave them the diagnosis would want them to believe. And that's the power of stigma, right? They see a disability diagnosis in a way worse than the medical model sees it. And the medical model is not very generous, right? And so we can think about the impact that has. I think it's worth, we have to speculate because like I said, up to 2/3 of students, they'll come to university, they will leave, the university will never know about their disability. So that means we have no idea what retention rates are, right? But my sense is that somewhere in the order of 250,000 students in the United States right now will leave university without seeking an accommodation because of struggles that might be related to things that accommodations could help. And that extends to mental health-related disabilities. Studies show that students who do leave university because of mental health-related disabilities, they knew about basic things like access to counseling and therapy, did not seek it, and left, right? So the other thing I'll say, National College Health Assessment, the most recent cohort, I know this is a little bit of a barrage of negative stuff. Part of this, I think, I'm trying to tell you this because you'll also hear stories from people who say there are more disabled students than there ever were before, and they're getting all this fancy stuff, right? And then you can say, no, I heard Jade talk, and he gave me this data, and I can access his notes, and I can see his citations, and I'll tell you you're wrong. And please do that, okay? Because that is an anecdotal thing that goes around. And it's a thing that goes on in the Chronicle of Higher Education as clickbait, right? It's not true. National College Health Assessment also tells us that there's an interesting, not interesting is the wrong word, and a somewhat alarming facet of the kind of generation of students, the cohort of students that are in our classrooms right now, okay? There's two things that were most distinct about the most recent survey. This is a massive survey across North America, okay? First, students were more likely to experience higher education as disabling, as verb, right? As causing disablement. And we can think about and see how that might be the case outside of many of the supports that they might have had at home, right? In a new environment that's asking, in fact, and I see this, very different things than high school was asking, right? Different stresses, less supports, et cetera, and so on. So I found it interesting that they even asked the question that way. I'm very happy they did because it's very revealing. So that's the one thing that this cohort of students said more than previous. And the second thing they said is that they're much less likely to seek help. So those two things are a tough combo, right? And so the one thing we could do is we could kind of blame students. Oh, this generation's not going to seek help. But I think the most important thing we need to do is ask questions about the help, right? And I realize this against the backdrop, and everything I've learned since I'm here, you all are unicorns here. Absolute unicorns in the sense that a lot of students seek and get accommodations, somewhere in the order of 20%. I mean, don't pat yourselves on the back too hard, because that's exactly what it should be everywhere. It's exactly what it should be everywhere, right? But that's something that you all should communicate. You should communicate to the students who are already here and value it, right? And validate it. You should communicate it to students who might come here in the future and their parents, absolutely, right? And you should use it to make sure that you're getting the funding and supports you need to help those students, right? You know, the truth is, if athletics and recreation get more students, thousands more students coming through their door, they can then go to somebody and say, hey, look how successful our programs are. We have a lot of people coming through our doors, right? Same thing for student success. You know, to run a writing center, you need to prove a lot of people are coming. So the same should be true for the funding of disability services. The truth is, the average operating budget of a disability services office is $257,000. Okay, I know because I read an article about it. There are like 7 assistant coaches at University of Colorado Boulder. The kicking coach makes more. Okay, this person's job is to help people kick a football, and I bet you that person's getting a raise. This budget's not going up, right? And it's been frozen around $257,000 for a long time, right? The average professional who's doing a great job there has a caseload, right? They're working with 250 to 500 students each, right? And so we shouldn't be surprised then that the range of accommodations generally that we can offer are a little bit limited, right? It may not be the case here, but across the country, the vast majority of the accommodations offered are simply extended time on tests and exams, right? The mid-sized university in Canada, University of Victoria, last year delivered 18,000 extended time accommodations, right? I'll talk more about this in a little bit. But, you know, the other thing I'll say is, it's not just that these offices are kind of overworked and underfunded. We also have a lack of supports for faculty and staff. Most universities in North America have no policy for accommodations for faculty or staff. People are compelled to disclose their disabilities to their chairs or their supervisors, which they should never have to do, right? Graduate students are compelled to disclose disabilities to their lab leaders who are also perhaps their supervisors, who control everything about their future, right? And there's, in general, not centralized funds. Even though most of the accommodations don't cost anything, there's no institutional memory about how to deliver them, so it means they don't get delivered. You know, say all I needed was a stool for this podium, right? I would wait 4 weeks into the term for that stool to be there. Many days after I got it, somebody would have taken it out. Right? Just simple things just don't happen because we don't have a system that even imagines that there would be disabled staff or faculty. So that's part of the issue as well. Okay, so that's my really cold porridge, right? That's like straw plus cold porridge, okay? In response to this history, and I should say, like, this history maps out against the history of eugenics and scientific racism. Like, there are these intersections. Disability has been used as a stigma that could be applied to other marginalized groups to keep them out of higher education, to keep them away from access to power and knowledge, and we know that's the case, right? So it maps out against this entire history. And to be honest, universities have built that has built the research base that justified that kind of exclusion, right? So, okay, in response, what we've done is what we tend to do is what I call retrofitting, right? And yesterday someone was talking about that sometimes here, when you get a big snowfall, stuff doesn't get shoveled. Instead, they just put up emergency tape around it. Right? Or we were talking about an example where there was a set of stairs that was dangerous, so they put a plywood ramp on top of it, right? This happens at my own, you know, the building where I work is supposedly an accessible building. There's one elevator in the building. It's as far away from the offices and teaching space as possible, and it's the freight elevator. It means that's where the shipments come in and all the garbage goes out. And it's at the freight entrance, which is where the garbage comes out and the shipments come in. And it's often broken, right? But it measures up to, in Ontario, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, right? And so we see this kind of in a ubiquitous way, right? There's a ramp, it's around the back of the building, right? There's an elevator, it's often broken, right? There's a stair lift. Has anybody ever used a stair lift? Okay, to use a stair lift, you need to go find a janitor who has the key to that stair lift, but they haven't used it for a long time, so they're not sure which key it is, right? If you can find a janitor, right? And then they come, anyway. It often leads to another stair lift or another elevator, right? So these are some of the ways, and it's a metaphor too, okay? So it's just like, okay, I had some steep steps examples. The Carillon Tower, right? I realize not many people come and go from that space, but what we're seeing here is a view upwards from the downstairs, right? And there's a spiral staircase that does lead you, or you can get up to the top of the tower, right? But it's just that upward idea, right? That upward trend that some people make it and some people don't. So this is an example that I use for retrofitting. And this student is Sarah Marie De Silva. This is at the University of Hull in the UK. Just doing a time check. Sarah Marie, this is a zoology lecture that she goes to, and people can recognize this kind of classroom. It's an amphitheater-style classroom. Students enter at the back of the room, which is the highest point in the classroom. There's a set of stairs that lead down. There's a railing along the side there, and students have to go down the stairs to access tables or desks that are arrayed laterally across the classroom. Students in this picture that have gone down those stairs and that have accessed those tables, they're sitting, their laptops are open, they have their tea or their coffee, right? They're taking in the lecture, they're engaged, they're taking notes, right? Sarah Marie's at the back of the room and she's pissed, right? Her arms are crossed. There's only one spot in the whole room where Sarah Marie in her manual wheelchair can sit, okay? We know rooms like this, okay? This is labeled, when you go to the University of Hull, they have a thing called the access map, okay? And it's a way for them to brag about their most accessible features. This classroom is on the access map. Can anybody look at this image and help us identify why the frick this would be on the access map? Sure. Yes. So they've spent about, I don't know, 5,500 pounds to insert a button, okay, that opens that door. What would happen right now if somebody came and pressed that button? Yeah. Yeah. She would have, we can think of all the different entailments of this, okay? She would definitely have to wait and be the last person into the class every single class session. If somebody came late, she would have to move out of that vestibule so that the door could open so that they could come in, or she'd get squished against the wall, right? This kind of thing is all over our campuses, unfortunately, right? These features that we kind of brag about and we spend money on, but they don't actually advance access at all, okay? And to me, that's a metaphor, because we have the back door to access in every syllabus. And it's the statement that says, if you have accessibility needs, go elsewhere. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do that. It doesn't mean we shouldn't have buttons like this. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try to problem solve to make classrooms more accessible. It just means we don't put any thought into it, right? If we actually audited our campuses, if we had disabled students audit our campuses and prioritize which things should get fixed first, we could spend money in a really smart way, right? But we don't. We have a button on one door and then the next door has no button. So why did we spend money on the one button? The other thing I think I could say is, and this happens sometimes when things get shut down or there's snow or whatever, if you were to traverse this campus for a day and you only went through doors that had push buttons, and you only went up ramps, not stairs, and you only used elevators, not stairs, for a day. I'm not saying to do this. It's not the point of being a disability tourist, right? It's just to say if you did that, it would be striking how much more energy and time that took each day. Okay? And that is a metaphor for this retrofitting approach to disability is like, yeah, there's access. You know, disabled students are invited in, they're counted and added to diversity statistics, right? But most of the changes we've made are actually designed so we can keep things the old way. The accommodation statement on the syllabus says, I'm not changing anything in this syllabus. You, disabled person, go elsewhere and get things changed just for you. It's like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. You know, what happens for that disabled student stays with that student, and they have to negotiate it over and over and over again. And there's nothing that compels the instructor to say, hey, what accommodation was needed? Could I change what I'm doing, right? So that that student doesn't have to traverse that geography over and over and over again, right? Again, we see the effect. It's working. Students with disabilities are being marked out for wearing out, and it's working, right? It's taking them longer to graduate if they do, right? The graduation rates are lower, right? So if we wanted to build a machine for discrimination, it's working, right? And I guess I think we all agree, right? I'm not preaching to the choir, I know that, but I think it's another way of saying, you know, it's not enough just to have disability services. It's not, and they would say that too. It's not enough that a lot of students go there, right? A lot of us in this room, so how many, I already said most of the accommodations that are offered are extended time on tests and exams. I think probably there's a lot of people in this room who don't offer any exams. Am I right? Okay, don't pat yourself on the back too hard. Again, I'm the same as you. But the whole system is not built for your classroom or your pedagogy. The whole system is working for a model of education that you don't use. Great, we can congratulate ourselves about that, but we need to build a system that accommodates for what we do too, right? So I just think that's really important. And that is about kind of how the retrofits work, right? The truth is, we also know it's been traditionally difficult to access, to do that Las Vegas thing, the over and over and over again. Like, it is not easy to get a diagnosis. We have undocumented students, we have international students, right? I want to say too, like, a disability diagnosis means different things to different students. There's this unbelievable book by Keith Mays, it's maybe about two years old now, it's called The Unteachables, and I highly recommend it. It shows that disability diagnoses in North America since the beginning of these diagnoses have been used for white student protection, right? Having a learning disability diagnosis in K-12 education for, in Canada, Indigenous students, for Black students, it means something different. It's a way to move those students out of the possibility of college or university, right? There's differently stigmatizing for young Black men to have a psychiatric diagnosis, right? But the problem is we don't treat the services differently. So we have to understand that it is different for international students. It is different for undocumented students. It is different for students, for Black students, for Indigenous students, right? But we don't make those changes. We just assume it's one size fits all, go get the help, right? Again, these are students who are not accessing help, and I don't think that's their fault. I think the help needs to change, right? Okay, so I'm getting along to, I have a whole rant I could do more about time tests and exams, because the truth is it's just overwritten disability. And in fact, it's a really problematic because it's constructed disability as affiliated with cheating in higher education, unfortunately. If you go and do a Google Scholar search around disability in higher education, almost all the results are extended time on tests and exams fair? There was a study that was really recently done in Canada, and it was published and written up in the largest newspaper in Canada, the Globe and Mail, which is the national newspaper, kind of our New York Times or Washington Post or something. A researcher emailed disability services offices and faked being disabled to see if they would give them accommodations. Guess what? They all said, we'll give you accommodations, right? Which is what they should do. We can get documentation later. We can figure this out later. Let's get you accommodations now. Very minimal accommodations now. There was this outrage around this. It proves that students are cheating, right? So I've given you enough to know that that is a really problematic narrative, but it's a popular narrative. And it's because of the retrofit model. It's because of the dominance of time tests and exams. Like, there's no good reason to make an exam timed. We kind of all know this. I don't need to go down this road. Like, I'll talk about it more if you all want to email me. I've got an entire annotated bibliography on this I'll share with you to anybody who asks for it. But the other thing I'll say is it's this huge missed opportunity, because one of the biggest things we do in higher education is we help people learn how they learn, right? We could have this magical thinking that says, you know what? The book I assigned in week 7 was so crucial, you know? But actually, I think probably the majority, and maybe 60 to 70% of what students learn in higher education has nothing to do with the curricular choices we make. It's a lot of other stuff, right? But one of the big things it is learning how to learn. And if disabled students are only learning how to get accommodations that they need for a time test or an exam, what a wasted opportunity. There are very few careers where that kind of high-stakes timed delivery matters. You know, as a joke, I would say way too much, I'm sorry, but like nobody walks into an engineering firm and says, whatever bridge you've designed, put your pencils down. Whatever bridge you've designed, we're building it tomorrow, right? No, because we want reflective thinkers. We want collaborative thinkers, right? University of Waterloo, where I work, is a big co-op school. Our students go out and they work jobs and then they come back. The employers don't like them. Not because they're not smart, not because they're not hardworking, but because they're competitive with other employees, because they don't know how to collaborate. They don't know how to give or get feedback. They don't know how to think twice. They know how to memorize stuff, and they want to be congratulated for memorizing it perfectly. So that's a bit not fair, sorry. It's a bit of a caricature. But on the whole, that's a thing, right? So anybody who says, you know, we need to be tougher on students to get them ready for the real world, we're not doing a great job on that vector of disability with helping people learn how they learn. And that affects everybody, right? So yeah, harm reduction. If I could change one thing about higher education tomorrow, no more time tests or exams. Or I'd say give me a research case for why it's important, right? And they just don't exist. And I've done the research, you can't find it, right? Okay. The other thing I'll say is in K-12 education, we're moving away from testing. I've got a kid in grade 11 who had his first exam last week. That's not going to change. Standardized testing, we're going away. It's optional. Many universities, it's becoming optional. The LSAT just lost logic games, right? Why'd they lose them? Because they had no bearing at all on whether students were going to be successful in law school or successful as lawyers. Right? It was a blind student who brought the case to challenge that, right? But that impacts everybody who has to take that stupid thing, okay? So the trend is moving away from it. So we're going to be stuck on an island if we keep doing it. You all know that. I said I wasn't going to do that, but then I just did it. Sorry. Okay. I think, however, right, when you look at the DU website, okay, the homepage at DU, it doesn't show students in a gymnasium writing an exam, right? They're engaged in experiential learning. They're making robots and they're wearing VR headsets and, you know, or they're working in the community, right? Or they're on top of a mountain, or they're in the middle of an ocean, or they're in Africa, or they're in Belize, right? You know, they're engaged in the future of education. That's what they pay to be here for, right? My point is the future of education needs to be made accessible as well, right? And so that's burning hot porridge, wood. Okay, we've made huge changes in higher education. We've done it. The last 5 years, we've made huge changes that you never would have predicted. It proves we can change. We want the right conditions. We didn't have the right supports. We were rushed. But we did it. Okay? There's some data that I often point to. Okay, sorry, I did have some retrofitting examples here at DU. This is the community commons, right? Which in many ways, and I've been through it, is a very accessible space. But it's frustrating that so many times the architectural center or the aesthetic center of a space still has to be stairs. It's like that's the only, language that the architects know. I don't know how to make this place cool without these things, you know? It's like if there was this, if people have kids who play those games like Roblox or whatever, you know, like just disable that button, disable the stair button, come up with something else, right? But, so that was just one example. Sorry, and I should describe this for folks, like this is the community commons, it's a 3-floor space. It's very common to see this in even brand new buildings, right? You can kind of see the most light, the most perspective in the space comes from these kind of the openness of the staircase in the middle of the space, which I think is valuable and important. It could be an elevator, a glass elevator, right? It could be really cool, but it's not part of the vocabulary, right? And so it is stairs then in the middle of the space. And those are a lot of stairs. And at altitude, you can hear me, I'm faltering. You know, more stairs. Okay, another thing that I think is really interesting, there's this thing called critique access. And it has a whole bit about the University of Denver, right? And they have this bit about Marjorie Reed Hall. Constructed in 1929, like I said, collegiate Gothic style. Before renovation, it was described as old and scary. People used to joke about ghost stories here, right? The updated building after an $8 million renovation now provides accessible enhancements excluding ghosts, right? Maybe, maybe not. But I think people might have things to say about that and those enhancements and how that money was spent, right? I think it's the same thing wherever we are. Like I'm not picking on you, I promise you, right? See the same things in my own campus, see the same things every campus I go to. It's frustrating that we keep spending money. It's frustrating that we keep building new spaces that are supposed to be future looking and community building, right? And we think about access as an afterthought. The other thing that I found was really interesting. This is a TikTok account. Okay, I'm not even on TikTok. You can access Mason's stuff other places other than TikTok. He calls himself Wheelchair Guy in Denver. It's really cool because, like I said, if you had disabled students audit the campus, his TikTok account is this interesting audit of campus. And he shows really powerful things that you all should want to market around the accessibility of his dorm, right? Around how he gets to and is involved in community and social life on campus, right? And his classes and all these things. And he's followed by 80,000 people. He's a huge following amongst high school students who want to get a picture, what would it actually look like for me to be living on campus, right, at a major American university. And I think you should be proud because I think he's revealing that there is accessibility. He often has to hack things or have interdependence, right, with other students. But that's part of the TikTok account as well. So I found that, and I thought you might find it interesting. Okay, so I said, post-retrofit, we've done a lot of things, right? I'll give you, as I said before, there's very little research around disability in higher education that's not just about time, tests, and exams. Well, the only major study that I've seen that actually asked disabled students what they would want. Yeah, I'll say that. The one major study that actually asked a massive group of important students what they would actually want in terms of accommodations. It was done at the University of Illinois. It's over 400 students in a school of engineering. This was pre-pandemic. What they said they wanted was, and I want to get this right, What they said they wanted was recorded lectures as videos, transcripts for these videos and for lectures, course textbook and instructor notes and slides that they could engage with offline. Asynchronous learning. These were most of these things were things we said we could not do for disabled students for decades. Flexible attendance policies we said we couldn't do. Impossible. You have to be there in person. You see where I'm going with this? Until all of a sudden we needed to keep collecting all the tuition money. But in fact, you can't come in person. You know, there will not be a 50-minute class. You're going to need to access all these materials that we've made available for you. Instructors, you're going to have to make them all available tonight, please. Right? But we did it. It's good to know that we did those things. We should keep doing them. You all know once you did create a transcript for a lecture or a set of shared notes for a class, it helped you too. And once you did it once, it's a lot less labor to do it again. In fact, you had your notes for the next time you're going to do it, and you can make the changes. You can remember which was the bad joke that bombed, right? Or whatever. You take it out, you put in a new one that'll bomb. But it's a step, right? It's the bowl of porridge, right? There's something there, right? I also think we know that there are accommodations that can really help students in the classroom, but then they're also transferable, that will help them in the future, right? That will make them actually more interdependent and collaborative in ways they need to be, right? That may make them more reflective, give them more time to think, right? Give them more time to revise their ideas, to learn how to get feedback from other people and give it to other people, right? And so disability, like in disability studies, a big product of the social model of disability, this idea that we can change the experience of disability by changing how we talk about it, is universal design. And you all know about this. You've had your innovators and leaders in universal design. But I'll go over it anyway, just for the sake of going over it. Universal design was originally an architectural movement that came out of the disability rights movement. It was a way of saying we can build houses, we can build public structures from the beginning for the most diverse range of possible users. We could build a house that you could live in from the time you're born until you don't need the house anymore, right? Like, because it could be level, right? Because the bathroom could be accessible, the kitchen could be accessible, and you wouldn't have to make changes later. It would cost the same, right? I'll also say out of universal design, we had, as an architectural movement, we've had universal design in technology. Every single cool thing that your smartphone does, serious, I'm not kidding, and you can test me. Every single thing that's cool that your smartphone does was originally a very expensive niche technology only for disabled people. And now we just take it all for granted. But it's changed our lives, right? So design from disability by disabled people has already changed our world, right? And when you design for and through disability instead of around it, right, it's better for everybody. In technology, we call it the electronic curb cut effect. We can think about curb cuts. Like, I'm old enough that I used to write letters to the city council asking for curb cuts. Well, we don't build sidewalks without them anymore. It's less concrete. But also, it's more accessible for strollers and skateboards and animals and everybody, right? And drainage and everything, right? So what in our pedagogy, what in our teaching, what on our syllabus can we design, thinking about the students with disabilities that are already in our classes, whether we know it or not, right? Thinking about the disabled students who we want to be there in the future, right? Who maybe we don't know about them now, but we would like to build a culture in our classroom where they could come to see disability as a positive identity in a culture. Not that we're going to make them, but that we might design it so that they can be part of a community, right? Where their disability identity is something they value. We know that unfortunately lots of young people don't, right? So that's the idea of universal design. In universal design for learning, there are three major tenets. The first is multiple means of representation, and that's what I call positive redundancy. Giving it to students in a variety of ways, right? Having a video, but having a transcript. Having a description, right, of what you're showing. Like, I'll give one example for that. People who've been in classes before, I had one of the first classes I had was an art history course with 500 students in it. It was just slideshow, right? If I could have seen the way my instructor described a piece of art, described it, right? I would have learned so much just from how they described the slide. It's the same thing for when we show any charts or figures. We know how we read those things. Students haven't learned how to read those things, right? Presenting that data a variety of different ways is simply better for all learners. And we're going to learn more about how to teach by doing that, right? So positive redundancy is a big piece. There will be a video of this. That will be transcribed. There's captioning. There's a QR code back there where you can get my notes. You could read them later. You could say, I didn't like that talk, but he mentioned this thing. We have the notes. You can go find the thing, right? So positive redundancy, that's the first piece. The second is multiple means of expression, and this gets at assessment, right? We have these unfortunately, we've come to have really narrow modes for how we assess students. And that means they often can't show us what they've learned in a very reliable way. Timed exams are a really noisy way to know what students have learned, right? And they're not a fair way to assess students either. What we're assessing lots of times is ability to handle stress, ability to temporarily memorize things. It's not about retention. It's not about all these other things we should value, right? So multiple means of expression is hard. We were talking about this morning. It's hard to give alternatives because we're obsessed with fairness. We're obsessed with the idea that everybody has to be measured against everybody else. And students because we're too obsessed with that, students get too obsessed with that too, right? The thing about that is that's not a learning outcome. Uniformity, fairness. It shouldn't be. It should definitely not be a dominating one, right? So we should be open to the idea that if a student doesn't want to give oral presentation, they might be able to call you and leave a voice note or text you a voice note. That's what they would do, right? Not call you, right? And you might then say, okay, well, in this class, I need to push back on that a little bit. How about we take some steps? You give the presentation to me or to a small group to begin with. Can we get to the stage where you're more comfortable doing that, right? It is still a negotiation. The example I give for this is my participation policy. And I'm glad to share this with anybody who asks me for it, right? I used to give participation based on how many times you put your hand up in class, right? And what I've done is I've said to students, you tell me all the valuable ways you can participate. And every single term I get new examples. This generation of students, someone was talking about this the other day. I'm stealing this idea from someone in this room. Can't remember who. I'll remember later. Said, people talk about the pandemic and they're like, oh man, these students were so badly impacted by the pandemic, right? They're not connecting with other people, they're lonely, et cetera, and so on. That was you. Yes, sorry. Okay. But you know what? Through the pandemic, they actually really learned how to connect with other people in a lot of ways. Those forms of participation, creating group message boards, right? Sharing notes, connecting with one another outside of class. Those are skills that the pandemic did teach, and I saw it in my own kids, right? Did teach. And so that's just one example. I'm glad to share that participation policy. I had a student one term who did minutes for every class. That's really a weird example, right? It's like their parents were in Parliament or something. But it was so helpful to me because when I got an email that said, hey, Jay, I missed class, what happened? It's like, hey, here's the minutes. But the minutes also were a way for me to hold up a mirror and say, what did we cover? What did students think we covered? right? What did they prioritize? The same thing with shared notes. The other thing I'll say about that is it takes a little pressure off of us in the sense that it creates an expectation that we work together to build access, which again, that is a transferable skill that matters, right? That there's some responsibility actually to share that labor, right, in our classroom. And I know that's important to us because we keep being told all the other things we're supposed to be doing, right? That, you know, you all have 10-week terms. The inflation of stuff you have to jam into 10 weeks is nonstop, right? So the other thing that I'll say is scholars of universal design for learning, they talk about it as +1 thinking. And I have two. I have an example here of a long list. There's like 1,000 universal design ideas. And the way that I talk about it is I say, just try one. It will be a gateway drug to more universal design. But don't take it all. Don't think you have to redesign everything. Try one thing at a time, see how it works, right? That's that +1 thinking. You create transcripts the one term, the next term you do shared note taking. It just becomes part of the pattern until you've got a more accessible classroom, right? But I also want to say -1. For everything that you do that adds a little bit more labor to create access, to connect with students, to build relationships and community, take something away. You have to. One of the best things you can do for access right now is take something away. And my suggestion, I might be a little bit biased, maybe start by taking away time tests and exams. You knew I was going to say that. But in general, take away an assessment. Take away one assessment. Assessment takes up too much of our time, right? Take one major test and have students grade their own. And don't count the grade, right? That might shift some emphasis, too much emphasis to some of the other grades. Increase the participation grade and give tangible ways where participation is shared responsibility to create access. Okay, so I'm gonna wrap it up because I want to have questions and I want us to chat. I've got a ton of other ideas and examples I could give you, but I get the sense that people in this room have examples too. So I would say, in addition to questions, if you have ideas, right, or connections that people might make here on campus to learn about more of these ideas, then let's share those too. We have a question here already. If for questions, I'm going to, thank you. For questions here already, I'm going to, yeah, it's right here. I'm just going to turn it on. Do I need to hold the button down to turn it on? Oh, that's. Yeah, there was a question right here, plaid shirt.
Yeah, I just had like a personal anecdote because you mentioned like talking about how the extra time on the tests, students often feel like they're cheating the system. And I'm 3 years out of high school. I'm a third-year Guild student here at DU. I do online. And one reason why I do online is because when I tried going in person at a different university in Colorado, I'll give you a hint, it's in Grand Junction, it was not very accessible for my disabilities, and I dropped out 30 days into the semester without getting a single credit. And I've been doing online ever since because of how inaccessible on-campus learning is for people with ADHD and anxiety like myself. But in high school, I always got extended time on AP exams. I was an AP student. I had a 4.4 GPA. I was very like driven and motivated, and I genuinely liked to learn. But I would get extra time because of my disabilities, and I would get extra time on the SAT and on these standardized tests. And a lot of people in my AP classes resented me for it, and they thought that I was cheating the system. And it got me to attend these IEP meetings with my parents and with my teachers and beg for less extra time. I remember very vividly, I was in an IEP meeting begging to have 25% extra time instead of 50% because I felt guilty for cheating. I felt like I had it easier than my peers and like I didn't deserve my test scores because I got very high test scores. And they insisted on me keeping the 50% extra time because they said, well, just because you don't use all of the extra time, having it helps
Yeah.
you perform better because of your anxiety. So not having that pressure of having extra time is why you get it. But I just like deeply resonated with you talking about how students will often feel kind of like imposter syndrome, like they'll feel like they don't deserve the accommodations that they're getting, and that's why like as a third year student I just started asking for accommodations now, and I am also relating to like how difficult they're making it, because they're like, we need documentation that you have all these things. And I would think that me submitting things days late is documentation enough to prove, because like I work 40 hours a week too, at least. And so professors not even allowing me to submit something late, like they completely close the discussion or close the assignment, is very inaccessible to me. And I think it's even more inaccessible that when I speak to an advisor about this or a counselor and they tell me to go get accommodations, I get an email the following day saying that I need official documentation when my medical records for just ADHD and anxiety and PMDD are over 1,000 pages. So that documentation is not as easy to provide as a lot of people think it is. And so I just wanted to provide a personal experience about how, like, you know, I very much resonated with everything that you said about what it's truly like to be a disabled student in America.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's so yeah, thank you. Yeah. It's so powerful. Like, I think in a way you just did in 45 seconds more than I could have. Seriously, I'm being serious. And the other thing I'll say is there are a lot of students like you. You know, it sounds unique. It's not, right? Like, the idea of what a student is and what they're dealing with, the picture that we have is so much more like yours. But you're made to feel, you know, the way that you described, you know? So, you know, students are all working, right? Like, it used to be you know, 30 years ago, there was this small percentage of students. Now it's over 40% of students, and the kind of work they're doing is very different. It's not, you know, working at the cafeteria. It's gig economy stuff that fits in all over the place. Like, it's, anyway, thank you so much for your comment. It kind of like underlines and highlights and circles so much of what I was trying to get through.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Yep, here and then there. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we got three, all maroon.
It's the trending color. I wanted to ask about graduate education, which is my particular hobby horse. As I prepare to like do my dissertation, which is going to be around accessibility of graduate theological education for neurodivergent people specifically, I'm noticing a real gap in the literature of researching. I mean, there's not enough research around accessibility in higher ed at all, but it's like so much of it, what there is really addressed to undergraduate students, and especially around like the transfer between high school and undergraduate. And there seems to be this prevailing assumption that if you are able to get into graduate school, you no longer need academic accommodation or you don't need support.
Yep. Yes. So I'll give a couple examples just to, kind of just to underline what you said. Like, we need the research, you know, and I've talked to a bunch of people over the last couple of days who are doing some of that research here, and I just want to encourage you, you know, like, push it, get it out there, get it published, because there's nowhere to look.
Yeah.
Right? But so I'll give you an example. It was a very distressing day for me today about this. I won't get into it, but I've been working for 7 years at my university for a policy for accommodations for staff and faculty. And the first thing they told us, so in a policy at our university, it can be an S, it can be an F, it could be, I don't remember. There's student policies, staff policies, faculty policies, or it can be, and it can also be a G policy, graduate student policy. They're like, you can do this so long as it's not a G.
I am not surprised.
Yeah. And for years, our Office of Accessibility Services said we don't serve graduate students, as if they weren't students. right? So they had no employee rights because many, if not most, graduate students are also employees in a very diverse set of different employment circumstances. They're not protected. And then they're not really thought about in careful ways as students. Because you know what, the student experience for graduate students is drastically different from discipline to discipline, but it's also very different from the undergrad experience. And the biggest piece of that, I would say, is that there will be lots of well-meaning people who will say, it's okay, you'll get what you need, people will take care of you, right? And this paternalistic attitude. But in graduate education, to me, the biggest distinguishing difference is the people who are in a position to offer help have too much power over your future and your career.
Exactly.
So the
yeah.
idea that you would disclose is incredibly naive. Or the idea that there couldn't be negative consequences given the stigma, right? Given the role that some folks put themselves in differently. I'm going to say this, like my colleagues treat their role as graduate teachers very differently than they teach their role as undergraduate teachers. I have folks who, you know, they think their role as a grad teacher is, do you live? You know, like, do you deserve to be here? Which is different than how, well, sometimes they think about undergrad students that way too. But, you know, it's just so different, right? And your supervisor could also be your employer in a lab, for example, or in an RA-ship, or all these other things. So again, I'm just trying to underline what you said, that there is a huge gap there. And so if that's part of the research that you're doing, then really good, because we need more research. Even there's not that much data, right? Yeah, because
I'm going to try and do a pilot study for my dissertation,
Yeah.
and then hopefully
yeah,
get funding to do a bigger study on like the entire like ATS wide
yeah,
field of graduate theological education. But that's only one subfield, right? But as a disabled student, yeah, I started asking these questions like why is the assumption there's this idea of rigor with graduate education
yeah,
that even if I'm legally entitled to some of these things, I feel as if I should not ask for them, because the idea is, are you saying you can't be you can't do this in academia,
yeah.
which is like, yeah. So anyway, I'll keep you posted, I guess.
No, and the other, I guess, like the one other thing I want to say that's important just to say as a general statement, you know, disabled people are killing it in academia too. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, in graduate students, faculty, staff, they are what keep our universities going, right? And they do unbelievable amounts of invisible labor for one another, for students. They do care work, right? All these things. So just because the broad data is bad and it's dire, don't forget for a second, right? And you know, I don't know, this is maybe a question for people. There's times when I think like higher education is the worst place to be disabled. And then there's other times where I think, you know what, it's a really diverse place too. And there are these things about it, some character to it that lends itself, you know? So I don't know, maybe that's kind of an open-ended question. Because then that's the other thing, is like we need to be open to the idea that, you know, this is where we should be, you know? And that we're gonna figure it out, right? And I think probably maybe the first 40 minutes of my talk doesn't nurture that sentiment, but I think it's important.
Thank you. I guess first I just want to name something that I was thinking about as you were talking about, like the experience of graduate students who are told, like, you don't need an official accommodation, just people will take care of you. And you talked about the power dynamics there. I'm also wondering, and just having a thought right now about looping back to the notion of infantilization of people with disabilities, and looping back to the notion that you're kind of setting somebody up to have to be grateful.
Yes.
And to have to say
Yes.
thank you for the thing that just makes education accessible and possible for them.
Yeah. Yep.
That was not my question, though.
Sure.
A lot of conversation about just why don't people in the same numbers access accommodation and access the supports they need once they get to college. And you talked a lot about like stigma of it, but I'm also wondering, and maybe this is just my projection, but how many people, once they get to college and are really making those decisions for themselves for the first time, are reflecting back to the experiences that they had in public school, in elementary school, in high school, where those accommodations weren't really person-centered, weren't actually applied. They had them on paper, but had to ask for them over and over again, had to remind people, had to convince a teacher that that really was a need. And to what extent did that just kind of firm up their notion that even with accommodations, school isn't my place?
And their parents were in control of it. Yeah, like I think you're right. I think you're right. But that's part of the context and the full picture we should be understanding, right? It's too easy to blame students for not accessing help, you know? And it's complicated, right? Yeah, and it doesn't change instantly. Yeah, but I just want to say, like, you're doing some things right here that I think you should be, that I think actually being more transparent about would help the students who are already getting help here. It will help future students. It will help the identity. And that's the hard part. It's like universities are afraid to even admit how many disabled students they have. That shouldn't be the case, right? Anyway, I won't go down that road too much, but I think it's a big deal, and I think there's more people who are going to be very positively receptive to it than the university might think. Yeah.
Yes, so thank you so much for your talk and using your metaphor about the steps in Monsters University. I'm curious, what are some of your thoughts around those steps being intersectional barriers and identities? Because often when I come into disability spaces, there's this universalizing of, you know, disability communities and experiences, not realizing that, explicitly said, for a lot of us, the barrier and the steps are white supremacy. And a lot of us are being actively disabled by white supremacy, both in our life outside of the classroom and inside of the classroom. The ways that we have to almost degrade ourselves to get accommodations and asking for things at the same time as being disabled by white supremacist ideology and policies. And so I just am curious for a few more thoughts on those steps, because it's not said enough in disabled spaces, and I want to talk about it. So,
Yeah. So one person who I really want to point people towards who is really doing really powerful work and research on this is Joy Banks, okay? And just looking at those forces and naming them is so important, right? Keith May's book, The Unteachables, is really powerful. Even though it's a little bit more about the history of K-12 education, I think it's so important, like, folks in education need to all be reading that, right? But it should be informing how we think about higher education too, because it's the backdrop, it's the entire framing of disability. I'm sorry, the entire framing of the disability in North America has been in service of white supremacy. It's been about filtering certain students out of classrooms, right, and into the school to prison pipeline. That's it, you know, and it's all there, right? And so those same labels that are used to do that, we're then asking students to come and disclose those labels here. We can't expect that, right? Or we can keep doing it this way and we'll get the outcomes we're currently getting, right? And that's the hard part. It's like keeping it all a secret, sort of. I think thank you so much for your comments. And, you know, I know I need to learn so much more about this too, right? And, you know, the steep steps, we don't all start on the same step at all, right? And we need to understand that privilege, and we have to understand. The other thing I would say is, like, people think of the steep steps as like, well, you all can think about this too. And this is a differential thing.
I can think about all the different people who helped me up the steep steps. I can think of very few people who I really experienced as pushing me down. And that is the opposite experience for a lot of people, right? It's not just about where you started, it's about all the different interactions and relationships and microaggressions and, exclusions and all those things that happen. And that's the architecture. It's not just a metaphor. Yeah.
Okay, we have one last question. Sorry, y'all. DL has a quick question.
I'm going to hang around too.
Jay
so
will
if
be
people
here,
wanna
but I
chat.
know we
Yeah.
said it was at 2, and it's probably 2 now, but we're going to go like a minute or 2. I'm going to go ahead and let DL take DL's question.
Thank you, and thank you so much. I've been talking about your work for years, and so it's really wonderful to see you here. I want to go back to what you were saying about the recognition that this disability has stigmas differently across social identities. And I am wondering, as I think about a specific example that I won't go into for time's sake, is it possible, is it necessary in your mind to have to name to a student that I think there might be something going on here, versus just doing the dang thing, and approaching it differently? And I work with, the specific example I'm thinking of is a doctoral student, who's a Black man.
Yeah.
And I just want to hear you talk
Yeah.
about the necessity or not of needing to name disability in a space to a student in order to just accommodate or make the thing accessible versus
Yeah.
accommodating even.
Yeah, I think I'm a pragmatist, right? But I'm also kind of a rhetorician, so it matters how I kind of say it and frame it, right? So I know I kind of said this earlier, but the way that I think about it is yes and. So yes, do it. And when you do it, you're starting to build a structure in which there might become more of a possibility of being able to be out and vocal about it, right? It's yes and, right? It's not one or the other. It's not you must disclose, you must say this, right? It's too complicated. It's too freighted. It's too heavy, right? But if you just do the thing, right, and work with disability services, right, and understand that the thing that you did, just like any other thing you do in teaching, might be good for some students, it might not be for others, right? Understand that you might not know how to do it very well to start with, right? I think all those things are possible, but the thing you can't do is nothing, right? Because nothing has got us where the outcomes are bad, And the other thing I would say is yes, you do the thing, and it's going to have entailments you didn't know, right? People will see that you did it. You're modeling things that people are going to notice and recognize, and it has a knock-on effect, right? So that, I would say all of that, right? And at the same time, it's hard work. Yeah, so, yeah.
And as someone who was neurodivergent and not diagnosed until I was about to go up for tenure.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. But then I would just say, you saying that today out loud in this room, you don't know, but it's having a knock-on effect, right? And you didn't have to say it, and nobody forced you to, but maybe in this room today we built a context where we could, right? And so that's an example, right? And people will remember that anyway.
Okay, join me in thanking Jay for his talk and his visit. I know that the event is formally over at 2 o'clock, so if you need to leave, we feel no shame. Just do what you need to do. We did have a couple extra questions, and I think some of these questions are good for a lot of people to hear. So we're going to continue the conversation for about 5 or 10 more minutes, so if you can stay, please do. And I saw a hand right back here. We'll give you a couple minutes to let people leave.
Jay. Thank you very much. I have a question regarding of concepts, and then an additional provocation that I want to hear of you a bit more. And first of all, is regarding the universal design concept, because
Yeah.
I've read and heard, and by myself as designer, it's really difficult to apply the universal design concept because it looks like a one shape that fits
Yeah.
for
Yes.
everyone.
Yeah.
And yet it's not really, not always is something that is reachable.
Yeah.
But there are other kind of concepts like disability-centered, for
Yeah.
instance, that challenge even this idea of accommodation.
Yeah.
It's not thinking that you can patch something that's not working
Yes.
properly.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I want to know what do you think regarding rethinking all the education system, because it looks like something that had lots of mistakes from every different perspectives.
Yeah. So on that idea, and I'm not a designer or an architect, right? But the one thing that when you look at the history of universal design as it was created in the disability rights movement, it's become something very different now. Okay, it's become a kind of checklist now. And that's not what it was meant to be. In fact, it used to be called disability usability and universal design, DUUD. It's the usability piece that's missing in a lot of the way we talk about universal design now. And people who don't know what usability is, it's simply iterative design. It's that you build something, you get feedback, you change it, right? It's design that is like the way of thinking through something where you know you need feedback from users, and those users have to be the most diverse group, right? So if you center disabled users and you get feedback from them, then and it's designed as a verb, not as a noun, not as a finished thing, right? And so then that to me is really useful to think about in the classroom. It's not, and I had a professor who said this one time on Facebook. They were like, I universally designed my syllabus, and the students came up to me on the first day and said, this is great, I'll never need an accommodation. It's like, no, that's not how it works. And you have no idea what students might need. And the students don't have any idea what they might need, right? And it's like, the important thing is to build in, and I have lots of ideas for how to do this in the classroom, but like build in real feedback, real honest, anonymous, feedback, and then make changes in the middle of the term. Like, don't wait for student evaluations, right? But get feedback and make changes when you can. So that would be the philosophical answer to your question. And that's probably the best I can do with that. But, that history and overlap, between usability and universal design, somehow the usability part got dropped. Because I think universal design became really marketable. If you can say it's universally designed, you can sell it. But it's not, universal design was never meant to be finished in that way, if that makes sense. Yep.
Hi, this has been great. And I'm always interested in these conversations. And something that I'm finding myself thinking about is a lot of the conversations we have about accessibility and disability in the classroom. Right, we mentioned earlier that they seem to be focused on the undergraduate student, and that we need to create more space to have the conversations about graduate students. But I'm also wondering what you've heard in terms of the conversation about like faculty, the people that are doing the educating, because we're also assessed uniformly, right? Like every year we do our annual reviews and we put together our promotion and tenure packets. And so I'm wondering, and that's like, for me personally, I remember when we've gotten those emails of just, oh, we have a snow day tomorrow, it's super simple, just take what you've planned to be in person and just throw it online. Everyone can do that, can't you? Everyone can teach a high flex model of teaching where you have people in the classroom and people on Zoom and people in synchronicity. Everyone can do that, right? Yeah. And so I'm wondering in a sense where and how it's not just the receiving of information, but also the presentation and framing of information, I don't know, comes into these conversations.
So I have a depressing overshare, maybe. I alluded to this. I've been working on this committee to create a policy for faculty and staff for 7 years. And we are in a bit, like you all are in a bad financial spot as a university, like we're in an even worse one in Ontario. My Faculty of Arts had the same operating deficit your entire university had last year. I mean, Canadian dollars, so maybe that's not nearly as bad, but still really bad. Okay? And so we're working on this policy, and the main tenets of the policy was there needs to be a policy for faculty. They're not getting any of the accommodations that they need, and they're not asking for them because they have to disclose to their chair, who's a colleague, or a dean who does their performance review, or whatever, you know. And there's no central fund for this accommodations to be provided, and so it's coming out of department budgets. It's like, do you want to have sandwiches and salads, or do you want to have accommodations? You know, and so that's all the policy was, literally was, central office, central funding. You go to the central office, it's somebody there who's a professional who will never disclose anything you say to them to anyone you work with. Simple, right? So we've been working on this for 7 years. We just found out there's a new associate provost for accessibility created that's going to have a central office. Is not what we wanted. They took our idea, and instead of funding it the way we wanted it and making it protecting people's privacy, they've made this a university top-down thing. We don't know exactly that they're doing that, but right now we're pretty sure that that's what they've done, so that when we present them with the policy, that for 7 years they've been giving us legal notes and feedback and delaying, taking 4 months to read, to get back to us, and we finally deliver it to them and we're so close. They're gonna say, that's great, we already did it. But that's what's needed on the faculty side, right? And like, we figured out how we would handle performance reviews. We figured out how we would handle tenure and promotion, right? Hiring, from the moment the university contacts you. And the other thing is, like, universities are unbelievably susceptible to litigation, which is something that usually really scares universities. And maybe that's all, like, we need to push that even harder. But, like, universities have not covered their asses on this at all, right? Because no, hiring's not fair. When you say, oh, we encourage candidates with disabilities, but there will be no, like, how do you ask for an interpreter during your, I've written about this, okay? How do you ask for an interpreter during your interview? You email the chair of the search committee, you know, and then they think, oh, well, we're not offering you an interview, right? Anyway, like, I'm sorry that I don't have an answer for you, because I just don't, I think it's pretty bleak. Right? Because there's no imagination, and yet at the same time there are a lot of disabled faculty, right? And there are a ton of disabled staff, right? But it's hard right now when we felt like we were moving along this, but anything that was going to cost any money. I guess the other thing I'd say is, like, no, I actually think it would save money. And maybe that's an argument we're going to have to make, which I hate having to frame things in that context, but I just think there's a huge amount of repetition, lost labor. You know, I hate using those terms, but, like, yeah, it's true. And the other thing is, like, I don't know how this works, but, you know, biggest employers in the state of Colorado are probably universities? Coors. Promise you Coors has a disability policy. But huge, huge, huge employers where the average amount of time that somebody working there is a very long time, and where what they really don't want to do is constantly be replacing people. They want people to have long careers, right? Over the course of a long career, we are all going to need disability accommodations in some way, shape, or form. So why would you run an organization that's going to lose people? Why would you run an organization that doesn't address the reality of the employees who are there? Like, Coors knows that. Somebody crunched the numbers. It was like, it's better to accommodate the people who are here than to lose them and have to constantly be rehiring people. But universities are just doing it. And I think part of it is they don't want to talk about disability.
Is it also possible that we could have the same issue that we do with our undergraduates? We don't know how many faculty
We don't.
disabled, so we don't
Yeah.
know that's why we're losing them.
Yeah.
Because people don't also feel empowered to share that, and so we don't know
Yeah.
that's why.
Yeah, there was a thing in Canada, though, that just recently, it's forced universities to prove that they have disabled employees at all, right? And so then universities came up with a way to count people, right? But that's a game they play too, you know, so, but yeah, I mean, if you can't count them, then they just are gonna imagine there's nobody there. And again, like, you know, Frank, man, like, look at the periodic table of the elements. Like 17 elements were discovered by disabled scientists. Like there are disabled people and they're doing the work, you know, but they're just doing it and they've got an unbelievable number of barriers, right? And, you know, the barriers that are already arbitrary, like tenure and promotion, are just so much larger. Anyway, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't, like.
I know we're a small group now, but part of the reason I wanted to let it go is because we're recording this event, and these questions that you all are bringing up are wonderful, but I need to give Jay a break. So, thank you all that stuck around.